My Life, Chapter 2. My mother noted with much interest the slightest signs I might show of a growing love and ability for my work. She herself, though not highly educated, always created a lasting impression on all who really learnt to know her, and displayed a peculiar combination of practical domestic efficiency and keen intellectual animation. She never gave one of her children any definite information concerning her antecedents. She came from Weissenfels and admitted that her parents had been bakers' footnote, according to more recent information mill owners there. Even in regard to her maiden name, she always spoke with some embarrassment, and intimated that it was Perthis, though, as we afterwards ascertained, it was in reality Bert's. Strange to say, she had been placed in a high-class boarding school in Leipzig, where she had enjoyed the advantage of the care and interest of one of her father's influential friends, to whom she afterwards referred as being a Weimar prince who had been very kind to her family in Weissenfels. Her education in that establishment seems to have been interrupted on account of the sudden death of this friend. She became acquainted with my father at a very early age, and married him in the first bloom of her youth, he also being very young, though he already held an appointment. Her chief characteristics seem to have been a keen sense of humor and an amiable temper. So we need not suppose that it was merely a sense of duty towards the family of a departed comrade that afterwards induced the admirable Ludwig Geyer to enter into matrimony with her when she was no longer youthful, but rather that he was impelled to that step by a sincere and warm regard for the widow of his friend. A portrait of her, painted by Geyer during the lifetime of my father, gives one a very favorable impression of what she must have been. Even from the time when my recollection of her is quite distinct, she always had to wear a cap owing to some slight affection of the head, so that I have no recollection of her as a young and pretty mother. Her trying position at the head of a numerous family of which I was the seventh surviving member, the difficulty of obtaining the wherewithal to rear them, and of keeping up appearances on very limited resources, did not conduce to evolve that tender sweetness and solicitude which are usually associated with motherhood. I hardly ever recollect her having fondled me. Indeed, demonstrations of affection were not common in our family, although a certain impetuous, almost passionate and boisterous manner always characterized our dealings. This being so, it naturally seemed to me quite a great event when one night I, fretful with sleepiness, looked up at her with tearful eyes as she was taking me to bed, and saw her gaze back at me proudly and fondly, and speak of me to a visitor then present with a certain amount of tenderness. What struck me more particularly about her was the strange enthusiasm and almost pathetic manner with which she spoke of the great and of the beautiful in art. Under this heading, however, she would never have let me suppose that she included dramatic art, but only poetry, music, and painting. Consequently, she often even threatened me with her curse, should I ever express a desire to go on the stage. Moreover, she was very religiously inclined. With intense fervor, she would often give us long sermons about God and the divine quality in man, during which, now and again, suddenly lowering her voice in a rather funny way, she would interrupt herself in order to rebuke one of us. After the death of our stepfather, she used to assemble us all round her bed every morning, when one of us would read out a hymn or a part of the church service from the prayer book before she took her coffee. Sometimes the choice of the part to be read was hardly appropriate, as, for instance, when my sister Clara on one occasion thoughtlessly read the prayer to be said in time of war, and delivered it with so much expression that my mother interrupted her, saying, "Oh, stop! Good gracious me! Things are not quite so bad as that. There's no war on at present." In spite of our limited means we had lively, and as they appeared to my boyish imagination, even brilliant evening parties sometimes. After the death of my stepfather, who, thanks to his success as a portrait painter, in the later years of his life had raised his income to what for those days was a really decent total. Many agreeable acquaintances of very good social position whom he had made during this flourishing period still remained on friendly terms with us and would occasionally join us at our evening gatherings. Amongst those who came were the members of the court theater, who at that time gave very charming and highly entertaining parties of their own, which, on my return to Dresden later on, I found had been altogether given up. Very delightful, too, were the picnics arranged between us and our friends at some of the beautiful spots around Dresden. For these excursions were always brightened by a certain artistic spirit and general good cheer. I remember one such outing we arranged to Loschwitz, where we made a kind of gypsy camp, in which Karl Maria von Weber played his part in the character of cook. At home, we also had some music. My sister Rosalie played the piano, and Clara was beginning to sing. Of the various theatrical performances we organized in those early days, often after elaborate preparation, with the view of amusing ourselves on the birthdays of our elders. I can hardly remember one, save a parody on the romantic play of Sappho by Grillparzer, in which I took part as one of the singers in the crowd that preceded Phaon's triumphal car. I endeavored to revive these memories by means of a fine puppet show, which I found among the effects of my late stepfather, and for which he himself had painted some beautiful scenery. It was my intention to surprise my people by means of a brilliant performance on this little stage. After I had very clumsily made several puppets, and had provided them with a scanty wardrobe made from cuttings of material purloined from my sisters, I started to compose a chivalric drama, in which I proposed to rehearse my puppets. When I had drafted the first scene, my sisters happened to discover the miss and literally laughed it to scorn, and to my great annoyance. For a long time afterwards, they chaffed me by repeating one particular sentence which I had put into the mouth of the heroine, and which was Ich hör schon den Rittertrapsen, I hear his nightly footsteps falling. I now returned with renewed ardor to the theater, with which, even at this time, my family was in close touch. Den Freischütz in particular appealed very strongly to my imagination, mainly on account of its ghostly theme. The emotions of terror and the dread of ghosts formed quite an important factor in the development of my mind. From my earliest childhood, certain mysterious and uncanny things exercised an enormous influence over me. If I were left alone in a room for long, I remember that, when gazing at lifeless objects such as pieces of furniture, and concentrating my attention upon them, I would suddenly shriek out with fright, because they seemed to me alive. Even during the latest years of my boyhood, not a night passed without my waking out of some ghostly dream and uttering the most frightful shrieks, which subsided only at the sound of some human voice. The most severe rebuke or even chastisement seemed to me at those times no more than a blessed release. None of my brothers or sisters would sleep anywhere near me. They put me to sleep as far as possible away from the others, without thinking that my cries for help would only be louder and longer. But in the end, they got used even to this nightly disturbance. In connection with this childish terror, what attracted me so strongly to the theater, by which I mean also the stage, the rooms behind the scenes, and the dressing rooms, was not so much the desire for entertainment and amusement, such as that which impels the present-day theater-goers, but the fascinating pleasure of finding myself in an entirely different atmosphere, in a world that was purely fantastic and often gruesomely attractive. Thus to me a scene, even a wing, representing a bush, or some costume or characteristic part of it, seemed to come from another world, to be in some ways attractive as an apparition, and I felt that contact with it might serve as a lever to lift me from the dull reality of daily routine to that delightful region of spirits. Everything connected with the theatrical performance had for me the charm of mystery. It both bewitched and fascinated me, and while I was trying, with the help of a few playmates, to imitate the performance of Der Freischütz, and to devote myself energetically to reproducing the needful costumes and masks in my grotesque style of painting, the more elegant contents of my sister's wardrobes, in the beautifying of which I had often seen the family occupied, exercised a subtle charm over my imagination. Nay, my heart would beat madly at the very touch of one of their dresses. In spite of the fact that, as I already mentioned, our family was not given to outward manifestations of affection. Yet the fact that I was brought up entirely among feminine surroundings must necessarily have influenced the development of the sensitive side of my nature. Perhaps it was precisely because my immediate circle was generally rough and impetuous that the opposite characteristics of womanhood, especially such as were connected with the imaginary world of the theater, created a feeling of such tender longing in me. Luckily, these fantastic humors merging from the gruesome into the mawkish were counteracted and balanced by more serious influences undergone at school at the hands of my teachers and schoolfellows. Even there, it was chiefly the weird that aroused my keenest interest. I can hardly judge whether I had what would be called a good head for study. I think that, in general, what I really liked I was soon able to grasp without much effort, whereas I hardly exerted myself at all in the study of subjects that were uncongenial. This characteristic was most marked in regard to arithmetic, and later on, mathematics. In neither of these subjects did I ever succeed in bringing my mind seriously to bear upon the tasks that were set me. In the matter of the classics, too, I paid only just as much attention as was absolutely necessary to enable me to get a grasp of them, for I was stimulated by the desire to reproduce them to myself dramatically. In this way, Greek particularly attracted me, because the stories from Greek mythology so seized upon my fancy that I tried to imagine their heroes as speaking to me in their native tongue, so as to satisfy my longing for complete familiarity with them. In these circumstances, it will be readily understood that the grammar of the language seemed to me merely a tiresome obstacle, and by no means in itself an interesting branch of knowledge. The fact that my study of languages was never very thorough perhaps best explains the fact that I was afterwards so ready to cease troubling about them altogether. Not until much later did this study really begin to interest me again, and that was only when I learned to understand its physiological and philosophical side, as it was revealed to our modern Germanists by the pioneer work of Jacob Grimm. Then, when it was too late to apply myself thoroughly to a study which at last I had learned to appreciate, I regretted that this newer conception of the study of languages had not yet found acceptance in our colleges when I was younger. Nevertheless, by my successes in philological work, I managed to attract the attention of a young teacher at the Crews Grammar School, a master of arts named Sillig, who proved very helpful to me. He often permitted me to visit him and show him my work, consisting of metric translations and a few original poems, and he always seemed very pleased with my efforts in recitation. What he thought of me may best be judged perhaps from the fact that he made me, as a boy of about 12, recite not only Hector's farewell from the Iliad, but even Hamlet's celebrated monologue. On one occasion, when I was in the fourth form of the school, one of my schoolfellows, a boy named Stark, suddenly fell dead, and the tragic event aroused so much sympathy that not only did the whole school attend the funeral, but the headmaster also ordered that a poem should be written in commemoration of the ceremony, and that this poem should be published. Of the various poems submitted, among which there was one by myself, prepared very hurriedly, none seemed to the master worthy of the honor which he had promised, and he therefore announced his intention of substituting one of his own speeches in the place of our rejected attempts. Much distressed by this decision, I quickly sought out Professor Sillig, with the view of urging him to intervene on behalf of my poem. We thereupon went through it together. Its well-constructed and well-rhymed verses, written in stanzas of 8 lines, determined him to revise the whole of it carefully. Much of its imagery was bombastic, and far beyond the conception of a boy of my age. I recollect that in one part I had drawn extensively from the monologue in Addison's Cato, spoken by Cato just before his suicide. I had met with this passage in an English grammar, and it had made a deep impression upon me. The words, "The stars shall fade away, the sun himself grow dim with age, and nature sink in years," which, at all events, were a direct plagiarism, made Sillig laugh, a thing at which I was a little offended. However, I felt very grateful to him, for, thanks to the care and rapidity with which he cleared my poem of these extravagances, it was eventually accepted by the headmaster, printed, and widely circulated. The effect of this success was extraordinary, both on my schoolfellows and on my own family. My mother devoutly folded her hands in thankfulness, and in my own mind my vocation seemed quite a settled thing. It was clear, beyond the possibility of a doubt, that I was destined to be a poet. Professor Sillig wished me to compose a grand epic, and suggested as a subject the Battle of Parnassus, as described by Pausanias. His reasons for this choice were based upon the legend related by Pausanias, viz., that in the 2nd century B.C., the Muses from Parnassus aided the combined Greek armies against the destructive invasion of the Gauls by provoking a panic among the latter. I actually began my heroic poem in hexameter verse, but could not get through the first canto, not being far enough advanced in the language to understand the Greek tragedies thoroughly in the original. My own attempts to construct a tragedy in the Greek form were greatly influenced by the fact that, quite by accident, I came across Auguste Apel's clever imitation of this style in his striking poems Polyidus and Aetolier. For my theme I selected the death of Ulysses, from a fable of Hyginus, according to which the aged hero is killed by his son, the offspring of his union with Calypso. But I did not get very far with this work either before I gave it up. My mind became so bent upon this sort of thing that duller studies naturally ceased to interest me. The mythology, legends, and at last, the history of Greece alone attracted me. I was fond of life, merry with my companions, and always ready for a joke or an adventure. Moreover, I was constantly forming friendships, almost passionate in their ardor, with one or the other of my comrades. And in choosing my associates, I was mainly influenced by the extent to which my new acquaintance appealed to my eccentric imagination. At one time, it would be poetizing and versifying that decided my choice of a friend. At another, theatrical enterprises, while now and then it would be a longing for rambling and mischief. Furthermore, when I reached my 13th year, a great change came over our family affairs. My sister Rosalie, who had become the chief support of our household, obtained an advantageous engagement at the theater in Prague, whither mother and children removed in 1820, thus giving up the Dresden home altogether. I was left behind in Dresden, so that I might continue to attend the Crew's grammar school until I was ready to go up to the university. I was therefore sent to board and lodge with a family named Bohm, whose sons I had known at school, and in whose house I already felt quite at home. With my residence in this somewhat rough, poor, and not particularly well-conducted family, my years of dissipation began. I no longer enjoyed the quiet retirement necessary for work, nor the gentle, spiritual influence of my sister's companionship. On the contrary, I was plunged into a busy, restless life, full of rough horseplay and of quarrels. Nevertheless, it was there that I began to experience the influence of the gentler sex in a manner hitherto unknown to me. As the grown-up daughters of the family and their friends often filled the scanty and narrow rooms of the house, Indeed, my first recollections of boyish love date from this period. I remember a very beautiful young girl, whose name, if I am not mistaken, was Emily Hoffman, coming to call at the house one Sunday. She was charmingly dressed, and her appearance as she came into the room literally struck me dumb with amazement. On other occasions I recollect pretending to be too helplessly sleepy to move, so that I might be carried up to bed by the girls, that being, as they thought, the only remedy for my condition. And I repeated this because I found, to my surprise, that their attention under these circumstances brought me into closer and more gratifying proximity with them. The most important event during this year of separation from my family was, however, a short visit I paid to them in Prague. In the middle of the winter, my mother came to Dresden and took me hack with her to Prague for a week. Her way of traveling was quite unique. To the end of her days, she preferred the more dangerous mode of traveling in a hackney carriage to the quicker journey by mail coach. So that we spent 3 whole days in the bitter cold on the road from Dresden to Prague. The journey over the Bohemian mountains often seemed to be beset with the greatest dangers. But happily, we survived our thrilling adventures and at last arrived in Prague, where I was suddenly plunged into entirely new surroundings. For a long time, the thought of leaving Saxony on another visit to Bohemia, and especially Prague, had quite a romantic attraction for me. The foreign nationality, the broken German of the people, the peculiar headgear of the women, the native wines, the harp girls and musicians, and finally, the ever-present signs of Catholicism. Its numerous chapels and shrines all produced on me a strangely exhilarating impression. This was probably due to my craze for everything theatrical and spectacular, as distinguished from simple bourgeois customs. Above all, the antique splendor and beauty of the incomparable city of Prague became indelibly stamped on my fancy. Even in my own family surroundings, I found attractions to which I had hitherto been a stranger. For instance, my sister Adelaide, only 2 years older than myself, had won the devoted friendship of a noble family, that of Count Pachta, 2 of whose daughters, Jenny and August, who had long been famed as the leading beauties of Prague, had become fondly attached to her. To me, such people and such a connection were something quite novel and enchanting. Besides these, certain beaux esprits of Prague, among them W. Marsano, a strikingly handsome and charming man, were frequent visitors at our house. They often earnestly discussed the tales of Hoffman, which at that date were comparatively new and had created some sensation. Was now that I made my first though rather superficial acquaintance with this romantic visionary, and so received a stimulus which influenced me for many years, even to the point of infatuation, and gave me very peculiar ideas of the world. In the following spring, 1827, I repeated this journey from Dresden to Prague, but this time on foot, and accompanied by my friend Rudolf Bohm. Our tour was full of adventure. We got to within an hour of Teplitz the first night, and next day we had to get a lift in a wagon, as we had walked our feet sore. Yet this only took us as far as Lositz, as our funds had quite run out. Under a scorching sun, hungry and half fainting, we wandered along bypaths through absolutely unknown country, until at sundown we happened to reach the main road, just as an elegant traveling coach came in sight. I humbled my pride so far as to pretend I was a traveling journeyman, and begged the distinguished travelers for alms, while my friend timidly hid himself in the ditch by the roadside. Luckily, we decided to seek shelter for the night in an inn, where we took counsel whether we should spend the alms just received on a supper or a bed. We decided for the supper, proposing to spend the night under the open sky. While we were refreshing ourselves, a strange-looking wayfarer entered. He wore a black velvet skull cap, to which a metal lyre was attached like a cockade, and on his back he bore a harp. Very cheerfully, he set down his instrument, made himself comfortable, and called for a good meal. He intended to stay the night and to continue his way next day to Prague, where he lived and whither he was returning from Hanover. My good spirits and courage were stimulated by the jovial manners of this merry fellow, who constantly repeated his favorite motto, non plus ultra. We soon struck up an acquaintance, and in return for my confidence, the strolling player's attitude to me was one of almost touching sympathy. It was agreed that we should continue our journey together next day on foot. He lent me 2 20-kreutzer pieces about 9 pence, and allowed me to write my Prague address in his pocketbook. I was highly delighted at this personal success. My harpist grew extravagantly merry. A good deal of Chernosic wine was drunk. He sang and played on his harp like a madman, continually reiterating his non plus ultra, till at last, overcome with wine, he fell down on the straw, which had been spread out on the floor for our common bed. When the sun once more peeped in, we could not rouse him, and we had to make up our minds to set off in the freshness of the early morning without him, feeling convinced that the sturdy fellow would overtake us during the day. But it was in vain that we looked out for him on the road and during our subsequent stay in Prague. Indeed, it was not until several weeks later that the extraordinary fellow turned up at my mother's, not so much to collect payment of his loan, as to inquire about the welfare of the young friend to whom that loan had been made. The remainder of our journey was very fatiguing, and the joy I felt when I at last beheld Prague from the summit of a hill, at about an hour's distance, simply beggars description. Approaching the suburbs, we were for the second time met by a splendid carriage, from which my sister Adelaide's 2 lovely friends called out to me in astonishment. They had recognized me immediately, in spite of my terribly sunburnt face, blue linen blouse, and bright red cotton cap, overwhelmed with shame, and with my heart beating like mad. I could hardly utter a word, and hurried away to my mother's to attend at once to the restoration of my sunburnt complexion. To this task I devoted 2 whole days, during which I swathed my face in parsley poultices, and not till then did I seek the pleasures of society. When on the return journey I looked back once more on Prague from the same hilltop, I burst into tears, flung myself on the earth, and for a long time could not be induced by my astonished companion to pursue the journey. I was downcast for the rest of the way, and we arrived home in Dresden without any further adventures. During the same year, I again gratified my fancy for long excursions on foot by joining a numerous company of grammar school boys, consisting of pupils of several classes and of various ages, who had decided to spend their summer holidays in a tour to Leipzig. This journey also stands out among the memories of my youth by reason of the strong impressions it left behind. The characteristic feature of our party was that we all aped the student by behaving and dressing extravagantly in the most approved student fashion. After going as far as Meissen on the market boat, our path lay off the main road, through villages with which I was as yet unfamiliar. We spent the night in the vast barn of a village inn, and our adventures were of the wildest description. There we saw a large marionette show, with almost life-sized figures. Our entire party settled themselves in the auditorium, where their presence was a source of some anxiety to the managers, who had only reckoned on an audience of peasants. Genavova was the play given. The ceaseless silly jests and constant interpolations and jeering interruptions, in which our corps of embryo students indulged, finally aroused the anger even of the peasants who had come prepared to weep. I believe I was the only one of our party who was pained by these impertinences, and in spite of involuntary laughter at some of my comrades' jokes, I not only defended the play itself, but also its original, simple-minded audience.